From Temple University, this is Profiles in Literature, featuring interviews with authors and illustrators prominent in American literature for children. The moderator for this series is Dr. Jaqueline Shachter, Professor of Children's Literature with Temple University.
From Old Saybrook, Connecticut, comes today's guest, Ann Petry, who writes for both children and adults. When we wanted to arrange Miss Petry's visit, I had to contact her in Hawaii because in 1974-75 she taught literature and creative writing at the University of Hawaii. Do share anything that you think will be of interest concerning your Hawaiian experiences.
Well, I have to say first that Hawaii is so beautiful that it's unbelievable. In spite of all the stories and all the pictures, you don't really have any idea of what it's like until you are there. And that applies also to the people, who are stunning looking. I have a couple of amusing stories. One of them, when I reached the end of the spring semester in a creative writing class, I said to my students, well, now, is there anything that you would like to ask me? Do you have any questions? And I thought that they were going to ask questions about writing. And one young man, and I can only describe him as a brash young man, he really was. He was huge with great, enormous shoulders, very athletic, said, well, there is one thing I would like to know. And I said, what is that? And he said, well, what does your husband do for a living? And I said, well, of course, I'd be very happy to answer that question. But I would like to point out to you that you have been conditioned by the culture in which you live, because it would never occur to you to ask a man what his wife did for a living. And as far as what my husband does for a living, I'd be happy to tell you he is a retired advertising executive, and he used to be in New York City. And that was that. And the other story, favorite, and these are curious sidelights on Hawaii. For a while, you begin to believe that you're living in a foreign country. You have to remind yourself you actually are in a part of the United States. And then, of course, finally, I had to open a checking account in a bank. And I brought with me what is perfectly good identification in Connecticut, and also brought along a cashier's check from a savings bank, which in Connecticut is almost like, well, practically cash. But I discovered that that doesn't work in Honolulu. The only way they would permit me to deposit the check was if I had either a Hawaii state driving license or a state identification card. And I didn't have either one or the other. And therefore, I had to get an identification card. And in order to get that, I wrote to my husband and said, please send me a copy of my birth certificate and my marriage license. And he wrote back and said, what in the world does a bank need to have your birth certificate and your marriage license for? Well, anyway, I took these down to the place where one was issued those cards, and I'm fingerprinted and photographed. Oh. And that's the most interesting identity card, I think, of any state in the whole Union, and most unusual.
Yes, it is.
And of course, once I had that, I felt as though I had an actual existence. I was a person able to cash checks, buy merchandise in stores, and pay for it with a check. Up until then, I could not.
Unfortunate.
I couldn't even have a bank account.
Unfortunate. May I present the Assistant Coordinator of the Office on Work with Children, Miss Ellen Mae Mullen, and the Coordinator, Carolyn Field, my collaborator on the Profiles in Literature series. I've often felt that your works lend themselves very well to filmic adaptation. Have you ever been approached about filming any of them?
Oh, yes. Many, many times. In fact, one of my novels, The Narrows, was purchased by Columbia Pictures many years ago. And at one point, a good many years ago, I worked for Columbia Pictures. And one of the things I saw there that I always remember, one day I was walking through the hall and I saw a man pushing a sort of hand truck, and it was piled with papers. And I said, what is that? Well, he said, those are all manuscripts they've bought at various times and they've never used. They took them out of the vault just now to look for something, and now they're going back in. So I assumed that the Narrows is in the vault at Columbia Pictures, still sitting.
Not in too narrow a vault. May I have the pleasure of introducing Teresa Mason, a 6th grade pupil who has a question to ask you about Harriet Tubman, conductor on the Underground Railroad. Go ahead.
Hello, Miss Ann Petry. I'd like to ask you, what gave you the idea of writing Harriet Tubman?
Well, you know, I wish I could say that that was the result of a considerable amount of thought on my part. Actually, it was not. It was pure accident. And I think I ought to say most of what I write is the result of, I can only say, accident. I had been to a book and author luncheon in Hartford, Connecticut at a department store called G. Fox and Company. And they have a sizable bookstore in the department store. And at this luncheon, I had the pleasure of sitting next to Carl Carmer. He was born and brought up in New York State, in Auburn, New York, which is where Harriet Tubman had lived. And during the course of the conversation, he said to me, "Have you ever thought of writing a book about Harriet Tubman?" And I said, "Well, no, not really. I don't know anything about her." And he said, "Well, why don't you?" I said, "Yes, I'll look her up and see what I think." And I looked her up and thought, well, of all the people that I'd ever heard of or encountered, I was going to write a book about Harriet Tubman. And it was really the result of an accident. If I hadn't been sitting next to him, the chances are that book would never have existed.
Well, I'm interested in the fact that so often in the story, Harriet is coming naturally to Philadelphia. So did you do any research in the city itself? And also maybe take a look at the records kept by William Still in...
Oh, I own William Grant Still's book. Oh. And it is one of my treasures. At the time that I wrote that book, there was really very little interest in that particular period in American history. And though I don't know, I have no idea these days what Still's book would possibly sell for, because it's really a treasure. And it was one of the first books that I found. And it was, you really wouldn't need to do much more research than to use that, because it is so very graphic, it is marvelously written.
Where did you find it?
In a little bookstore, a secondhand bookstore in Harlem. Yeah. And I paid $10 for it, which is a very, very low price.
Well, following Teresa's question about writing Harriet Tubman, why do you think you write basically?
Why do I write?
Right.
Well, let me think if I can. I don't know that I ever even thought about that. It's just one, I think it's the only way I can express how I feel about the world, about people. I read somewhere that people who write do it because they're displeased with the world and they want to create worlds in which they, well, literally play God. They maneuver, manipulate. They create situations that they can control. Because we can't control much of the world. If you write, at least you control the world of your book. I think that's about it.
Following that, one of your first books for children was The Drugstore Cat, a delightful story about a little gray kitten called Buzzy. And in the story, Buzzy is concerned that a few people can understand his language. And he says, finally, I understand now. It's because the very, very young and the very, very old understand anything better than anyone else.
True.
Do you believe in this?
Oh, indeed, I do. And I do believe that there are cats. If you, I don't want to say really talk, but certainly you can understand what cats want. And I have a cat, and I often say to my husband about him, you know, he's swearing at us. And you can tell, I mean, you can really understand them very well indeed. And I wrote that particular book because of the fact that, well, you know, we're getting to be a very old family, and in my family we hadn't had any children, any young children, no babies born, and heavens, I don't know when, and my sister had a child. And in order, in a way to celebrate, I had to write a story for her. And we had drugstores, we all were cat lovers, so it seemed to me really quite fitting that this particular book for this first child should have been about a cat who lived in a drugstore. And that was true. that business about the cat thumping down the stairs and frightening away the burglars actually happened.
Very good. Well, again, it shows that authors write out of their own experience.
They should.
And I think they do their best writing when they do
They
this.
do.
In writing about Harriet Tubman and Tituba of Salem Village, were you thinking of young people learning about their past in order to understand the present?
Yes, and I'm not sure that I don't know that that isn't quite the way I thought about it, though it adds up to the same thing. But when I was in high school, and I went to high school in Old Saybrook, Connecticut, in a town where the great majority of people were white. And when I was in high school, in history classes, the only mention of black people in textbooks, the history, was slavery. And we were always portrayed as being a very happy-go-lucky people who were always dancing, playing. We were childlike. And I can remember at one point I stayed home from school. Now, I had no way of proving that this wasn't true, but I knew that this was wrong. And anybody who could think and think straight would know that this was wrong. And then, of course, when I did finally decide to write a book about Harriet Tubman, I wrote it specifically for my niece, because I wanted her to know that there had existed a woman with the kind of courage that Harriet Tubman had, and this woman had been a slave, and to me, in all history, this is the one great American heroine.
I agree. Very much.
I agree
so.
with you 100%, both about cats and Harriet Tubman. Because I'm a cat lover,
Well,
and
then
I
we won't have any
think,
argument.
no arguments whatsoever. But I would like to ask, do you enjoy doing research?
Not really.
You prefer to do the writing?
Well,
and
I would rather
than
do the writing, and it isn't that I dislike doing the research. It is that I find when you go back into another period, I always feel a little bit hampered. Principally because there are things that you simply cannot, you don't write freely because of the fact you're always running into the fact that something you're writing about probably didn't exist at that time. I think it's in Tituba that I mentioned when I first wrote it something about that young man in there and a pocket. Well, pockets were not used in that period, and it is that kind of little stumbling block that I don't like.
sort of nitpicking in a sense when you're flowing, the story's flowing.
Then you go back over this and you find you've done this, you've done that, and you take this out and take that out. I'd rather not, and yet at the same time, I feel impelled to create a picture of people who had what I call great courage.
And when you had your background with the Drugstore Cat, you didn't have to worry. 'Cause you were a pharmacist. Where did you do the research for Tituba? Because you must have done tremendous amount of that.
I should think you know the answer to that question beforehand, because you told me you had worked there in the 42nd Street Library in New York City, which is one of the world's great
I'm so glad you brought library into this.
Well, I would have to, because I owe a debt of gratitude to libraries and librarians. I really do. And as far as Tituba is concerned, some of the original documents, you know, are in the 42nd Street Library. And when you go there, I think about Hawaii and its state identity card. It isn't quite that bad. But when you go, you say who you are and identify yourself and why you want to see the thing that you want to see, and you think you're in the clear. Anyway, you go up, way, way up in the library, and you finally come to a room where they have bars on the door, literally, and it is a locked door. And you go there and ring a bell, and somebody comes and looks you over very carefully. And finally, after you've presented your credentials again, you are permitted to go in. And I really think that one of the great thrills in my life was when I saw that document of Tituba's, and here is this cross. And do you know that most of the people who are involved in that period in witchcraft in Salem could not read and write, and most of that material somebody has made a cross. Yes.
Oh,
has made an X.
Heartbreaking.
Yes, it
isn't
is. Yes, it is. And because in addition, you don't know what you're signing. You can't read it.
That's right.
You cannot read it.
Right. Well, you've done a lot of writing in other fields.
Yes, I
and tell us something about that. And do you think that helps you in your work as a novelist?
Well, I think all the yes, I think novelists. Well, I guess I have a kind of prejudice about that, but I do think the novelists write biography better than other people because they have become accustomed to, in the first place, making a thing move so that people will want to read it, they'll want to finish it, that kind of thing. Yes. In fact, I think all the different kinds of writing, they support each other, they help each other.
Well, did you do writing in the advertising field? And you did newspaper reporting, which also would help you in your gathering of facts and so forth. And I have one more question before Dr. Shachter takes you back, and that is about the theater. Now, I know that you've interest in theater, and you've written, have you written plays?
No, I've never written, well, I did. I wrote some children's plays. I did write some children's plays.
Plays?
Yes. Not commercially. No. I mean, you know. But anyway, about the theater, when I first lived in New York City, I decided, having I was struggling to write short stories, and I decided that I did at some time want to write a play, and in the meantime, I would join an amateur theatrical group, and I became a member of what was called the American Negro Theater, and we lived and had our being in the Library Theater on 135th Street and 7th Avenue. And we were there for at least 2 or 3 years. And many of the people who were involved in that theater became famous. And they included people like Ruby Dee, Harriet Belafonte, Fred O'Neill, Helen Martin. The list is endless. And they came out of that grubby little theater. Because I have heard people complain today about theaters, but they don't know anything about what it can be like, where there are no dressing rooms really other than a little cubicle, that kind of thing.
It sounds wonderful.
Well, it was fun.
And your works now appear in other languages, don't they?
Yes, they do.
Tell us how widely are they?
Well, the novels are, I think, practically in all the languages, Spanish, English, French, all the European languages, Czechoslovakian, all the Scandinavian languages, Japanese.
And your children's books, Harriet, Tubman, Tituba,
in France, in Holland, I don't know where else, but there particularly, yes.
And they are still in print?
Still in print, oh yes.
Constant demand for these books. Do tell us in some detail how you go about organizing your writing task. Do you begin with writing a plot outline?
Well, usually I begin with people, because they make the plot, and the plot should really stem from the kind of people that they are. And I have always, and I can't think of a time when I didn't, I have to know how the book or the story is going to end before I start, because then the whole thing builds to that. In the case of The Street, which was the first novel that I wrote, I had written the whole book before I wrote the first chapter. And when I wrote the first chapter, it was the most amazing thing, because I sat down and it just simply seemed to write itself. And it's one of the few things that I ever wrote that I didn't have to go back and do a lot of editing. That's it. And it's there.
Do you generally have to do a lot of rewriting?
Oh, endlessly.
You do?
Yes, I do.
You're a perfectionist.
No. I just feel that if you write things, people ought to be able to understand what you've written. And in order to do that, it's very rarely that you can write off the top of your head and people will understand it. You know, there's that old business about easy writing's cursed hard reading. And it's true.
Do you write daily? You do? Tell us something about, you were mentioning to me previously the importance of a journal for you.
Well, I write in a journal, and I do this every day, and I do it because, for the most part, people don't remember things very well, and even to the point where they couldn't say a month ago where they were or what they were doing. In addition, it has seemed to me in recent years particularly, all of us should write and keep a journal. And we ought to do it for the benefit of our families, our children, because there are things that happen to us. We are unique, each one of us. We're all different. And that uniqueness ought to be recorded somewhere. And unfortunately, I think historians are going to have a devil of a time in another few years because people don't write letters the way they once did. And historians, in order to get hold of a particular period, they have to have letters and diaries and journals and things like that in order to make it authentic. Some of the most interesting of the journals and diaries were those that people kept during the Civil War, when you knew what food cost, when you knew what they ate. You knew a record of life during that period. Well, to me, probably because I live right now, but I think this is one of the most extraordinary times in the world in which to be alive, and there ought to be a record.
Do you refer to your journals
yes,
often
I do.
when you're concocting your short stories, for
well,
example?
sometimes, occasionally, if I feel there is something that I can't quite remember that I want to put in a story, then I go back and look in my journal.
What are the special techniques involved in your writing of short stories? You generally have a very powerful ending, but what else do you think is essential?
Well, as one of my friends say, you sit at a typewriter and sweat a lot. But you have to be able to create in that short space, in a very few words, a believable character in a situation which the reader can understand, and it has to be done very quickly. And that is the problem, because yes, a novel, you can meander, you can go down all kinds of side paths. You don't have to stay right on the main road, so to speak, but you can't do that in short stories. You have to do this all very quickly and in a very small space. And there is here, I think, the same difference there is between a mural, which covers a great wall, and a miniature, which is a tiny painting done maybe on ivory or something like that, but very, very small. And to work in that small space, I think, is a great challenge.
That's a succinct analogy, really. Your short story, like a winding sheet, in tone and ending, reminds me of your novel, The Street, even to the same last name of the protagonist.
Yes.
Big difference, of course, is that The Street had a much more tragic, violent ending. 1.5 million copies of your novel were sold. What kind of fan mail did you get from its readers?
Fascinating, really, and much of it I sent, you know, there was a collection at Boston University in one of their libraries there called the Ann Petry Collection. So if you want to go look at my journals and my correspondence, it's all up there.
In Boston University
Boston University,
Library.
but the most...
Temple
the letters, well,
we didn't
the
get
letters they came from everywhere, all over the world. And they still come because the book is available usually some in paperback. It will disappear for a while, then it comes back again and again and again. So it's been through I don't know how many different editions.
That ending still chokes me. I want to know, are you more hopeful about the Ludi Johnsons of today?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I guess I would say that if we survived this long into this year, 1975, and if you stop and think of where we came from and how into this country, and who's the great bookmaker, Jimmy the Greek, wouldn't have given odds on our survival. But we did survive and multiplied in numbers. And we have. And so therefore, I think the odds now are that we will survive. I don't say better, I just say I think we will survive. I hope.
What suggestions can you offer to young people about how to get published and about how to survive during the period when they're struggling to get published?
Well, first, survival, because that's the important thing. After all, if you're not here, you can't write, so you have to survive. And I think that the only, really, I think perhaps everybody ought to read Thoreau's Walden, where the message is simply, you simplify your life. You even simplify the way you eat, the food you eat. You eliminate all what I call the junk food, all the soda pop and the potato chips and all that kind of thing, because this isn't going to build your energy at all. You eliminate that. As far as clothing is concerned, I think one of the greatest things in the world that ever happened was when people began to wear blue jeans. Now, this is a perfectly practical way to dress. Inexpensive, easy to maintain. You no longer have to go to dry cleaners and all that kind of thing. So that it's a matter of food, clothing, and shelter. And the shelter you keep as simple as you can, and you don't have any extra things around. And if you can live somewhere where people don't look in your windows, well, then you don't have curtains. If the floor is fairly attractive, you don't have rugs. That's from a maintenance point of view, because there's no reason to spend time washing curtains and vacuuming rugs if you can avoid it. So you just make it all very simple. So, and you get a job that does not tax your brain. Don't let other people use your brains. You get a job where, I don't guess they don't shovel coal these days, but get a job where you may have to use a certain amount of physical energy, but you're not using your head. You save your head for your own work, your writing. Remember that business about Faulkner wrote The Sound and the Fury, I think, in Boiler Factory. He was the night watchman. Well, he wasn't using his brains. He was just working on his book, but he was being paid. So you look for jobs like that. And you write, and you write, and you write. And you decide in advance that nothing and nobody, you're just not going to be stopped. No matter how many rejection slips, if this is what you really feel, this is the way in which you're going to express yourself, you write. I've told you how to live, told you how to write.
Well, who published your first short story after you'd gone through all of this?
It was published in The Crisis, which was the official organ of the NAACP. And it was because, and I say all of my life is a result of peculiar accidents, because it was published. A reader at Houghton Mifflin in Boston saw the story and wrote and asked me if I was working on a novel. And if I was, would I submit it for their fellowship award? And I wrote back and said, no, I'm not. But perhaps another year I will be, because it never occurred to me to write a novel. It always seemed to me that that was like trying to climb barehanded up the side of a mountain.
And that's how the street got started.
That's how the street got
What
started.
are some of your present writing plans?
Well, I always have a 5-year plan. That is, I write a novel, then I write a book for children or for young people, and then, of course, along the way, some short stories. So right now it's a novel. I have to write a novel. That's what's in the plan. If I ever get the time, I'm going to try to write a play. I've always wanted to.
Great, great. You carefully structure your novels, generally using a single setting as seen from the eyes of different characters. This is true of 116th Street in Harlem, of the Narrows section of Monmouth, Connecticut, of Lenox, Connecticut, and Wheeling, New York. Are Lenox and Wheeling patterned after Old Saybrook, Connecticut?
Let me see, Lenox and Wheeling.
In Miss Muriel and other stories,
yes, Wheeling is, yes.
Wheeling is patterned
yes,
after
it is.
Old
Very
Saybrook,
definitely.
Connecticut.
Yes.
And
a beautiful town, incidentally.
I notice, you know, I love these autobiographical references to the drugstore, in Drugstore Cat, in Country Place, and Miss Muriel and other stories. How long were you actually a practicing pharmacist?
Well, I tell you, I was born, literally born, over a drugstore in Old Saybrook, Connecticut. So that you might as well say I've been a practicing pharmacist since I was able to walk, because I had all the rules and the regulations of my, talking too long. Anyway,
no.
All the rules and regulations I knew by heart. And so I finished high school, I went to pharmacy college. I spent 3 years in a drugstore that we owned in the town of Old Lyme. And in the meantime, I was getting increasingly devoted to the man who was to be my husband, and finally decided that I didn't want any drugstores anymore. I was going to write.
I see.
Are we done?
I think this is it, really. I want to thank you very, very much. We could have gone on much longer. Miss Petry has been writing for over 30 years, beginning as a journalist with the New York Amsterdam News and winning a Houghton Mifflin Fellowship to do her first novel, The Street. Her second novel, Country Place, was a British book club selection. Her short stories have appeared in numerous journals, such as The New Yorker, Red Book, Opportunity, and Crisis, and in countless anthologies like Stories in Black and White and Black Voices. It's been a pleasure to know such a distinguished vanguard author. Thank you very, very much for coming.